being here. Dave, please give us a brief bio on yourself.
Well, I'm currently 23 years old. I live in Brazier Falls, New York. I grew up in Herman, New York. After high school, I moved up here with my mother, and of course, during high school, she was kind of all over the place. She lived in Fort Covington, she lived on the reservation, and then she lived off the reservation. She moved here to Brazier Falls, and everywhere she's gone, I've went with her. Mostly lived out in the woods. Not a big fan of living in towns or living anywhere there's too many people. I'm an avid hunter. I love being out in the woods. I do play video games, but not as much as I used to. Currently going to SUNY Potsdam. I am a biology major. As far as other activities, any outdoor activities such as fishing, even bow fishing, I love to do that stuff. Most of the time, I'll be working, cutting wood. I am working as a forester for Environment Division, Akwesasne, the reservation over in Hogansburg.
For you to spend as much time out in the woods as you do to this day after your family having the experiences they've had, you've got to have a lot of moxie to do that.
Oh, definitely.
I'd say so. Speaking of your family, we're going to talk about your mom's experience first. Before we get into that, though, does your mom have any interest in cryptids to this day?
She really hasn't had that much interest in cryptids. She never really was into it. Back in the day, I mean, growing up, most of the tales on the reservation were meant to scare kids, although there has been some truth behind them. But as she grew up, she grew out of it, didn't really fear anything out in the woods. She didn't really take anything to her mind. She did watch horror movies, but she never thought of them as real or she just thought of them as entertainment. And of course, up until now when I pester her about her encounter that she had out back, she gets a little bit more interested in it. And I was actually finally able to get her to watch 2 episodes of Dogman Encounters. So I think I'm kind of making progress on her.
When she did listen to those 2 episodes, how did she react?
Her reaction, I was actually surprised. It actually did kind of scare her a little bit, because the 2 episodes she watched were the Monster in the House episodes 1 and 2, and that explained all the unexplained animal attacks. And of course, when she was listening to ones where people were attacked in their own homes, that made her feel uneasy. And of course, we live out in the woods, so that would kind of have a reason to get you all jittery and spooked. Yeah, when you're living out in the woods like that, sometimes you'll hear things that are unnatural, or sometimes make your hair stand up on the back of your neck.
Oh, I don't doubt that at all. When you were small, did your mom ever tell you that monsters didn't exist?
My mother, my dad, almost everybody, they always used to tell me they never existed. My uncle, on the other hand, they used to scare me a lot when I was a kid, because they were really big into the paranormal. I mean, they even went as far as Halloween, they took really seriously. They used to get everybody over to the house, and we'd always watch horror movies every year. Usually not really slasher films, mostly just the classic monster films. And one of the films that we were shown was Silver Bullet, and we were all down in the basement. They all the lights turned off, and my uncle took it as far as dressing up as a werewolf, and he actually sat behind us. And whenever there's a scary part, you'd pick somebody and you'd grab him. And he grabbed me one night, and as soon as he did that, I took off running, and they never saw me again that night.
That was pretty dirty.
It was bad. I, needless to say, was not going into that basement for at least another 6 years after
that. I can understand. You're a werewolf aficionado. Of all the werewolves in movies you've seen, which werewolf scares you the most?
Most definitely the Beast from An American Werewolf in London, mainly due to its size and overall appearance and its ferocity. I mean, most other werewolf films, they are pretty ferocious, but nothing, I don't think, in any other movies depicts a werewolf attack as brutal as they were shown in that film. And overall, its design, I mean, I kind of guesstimated it's probably almost around the size of a black bear, so for a werewolf, it's actually fairly large, even if it's a quadruped. But Just that one alone is the only one that creeps me out. Even after watching that movie, it freaks me out to go outside in the dark.
Yeah, when John Landis created that creature, he definitely got it right.
Definitely. You scared a lot of people with that thing.
After having had your experience and seeing how your mom reacted to hers, did that reduce your enthusiasm for watching movies with werewolves in them?
Although it did scare me, and it freaks me out, I still continue to watch those movies. I just watch them now without as much fear as I had when I was a child. So, usually when I watch them, it's like, I just watch it for the entertainment. It's not like when I was a kid when I used to watch it, I was always sitting in the chair waiting for those next parts of the film where they were going to attack somebody, and then I'd always hide or whatever behind the chair under a blanket. Nowadays, I just love watching the films. Nothing scares me about them. Not even the documentaries that show eyewitness encounters and that. They still entertain me. Nothing scares me now. But, needless to say, going out in the woods, I'm still definitely watching around my six. Keeping an eye out, listening.
I'm glad you do. And I can understand why things on television wouldn't affect you very much anymore, considering you've been through the real thing.
Oh, definitely. Once you hear things and see things, it really starts to mess with your head a little bit, but then part of your head says, well, as long as you keep your wits about you, you should be fine.
Yeah, when you experience it in real life, there's a big difference. Please tell us about the area where you and your mom had your experiences.
Well, the first area is on the Akwesasne Mohawk Reservation. The area around there's quite a bit of swamp. Most of the reservation is nothing but swampy areas, but the rest is hardwoods, and there's very few pine forests there. The area behind my grandmother's house, there's mostly hardwoods, but it has sections of really thick underbrush. There's a lot of dogwood back there, a lot of crab apple trees and apple trees. And then, of course, there's meadows that have been cut out back there, because my grandfather used to have a few when they had the farm. And we do have one fairly large pine and hemlock forest that sits right next to the meadow. And then, of course, if you go further back, that's where the swamp starts. And since Ducks Unlimited came in there and dug out all the ponds for the ducks and the geese so they had better breeding habitat, there's a small creek that runs back there. It's actually fairly deep. The creek itself that they dug out was about 10 foot deep without water. And then once you got past that 10-foot mark, that's when the water started. So initially, the creek bed itself is probably close to 15 or 20 feet deep. So the only way to get across is by bridge. And most of it is cattails. There's a lot of areas that are just barren because nothing grew there. It's mostly mud and dirt. And then behind the swamp is the really thick hardwoods. There's maple, oak, birch, pretty much any plant species you can name off.
I don't know if you knew this or not, but dogmen seem to love swamps.
I did not know that.
Yeah, they do seem to love them. Whenever I hear about all these missing persons cases around swampy areas, I really get suspicious because they really do seem to love them.
And it kind of creeps me out because where I'm working currently, we've walked through some very large swamps.
I don't know if it's because people normally don't go into them or what, but yeah, there do seem to be a lot of cases of them being around areas like that. One afternoon in 1977, your mom went on a horseback ride that turned out to be unlike any ride she'd ever been on before. Please tell us what happened that day.
Well, she used to have a horse that she named Dancer, and she used to go out horseback riding quite a bit. She loved it. Well, one day she went out. She was by herself, and of course she took the long trail that we have back there. It's actually a four-wheeler trail. Back then I think it was mostly just for the tractor and the horses, because they didn't have a four-wheeler at that time. And she was riding back. She got about halfway across where the meadow is. The meadow was probably grown up at the time. It wasn't brush hogged. But she got across the meadow, and there's an area that we have as the landmark. We call it the porcupine tree because it's a big maple tree. The porcupines had killed, so they pretty much hollowed it out. It's still standing there today, but it's a very, very large tree. And at that tree, there was a fence. The fence cut across and marked the boundary between my grandfather's property and the neighbors. And right where that tree was, there was also a gate, and the gate was used for the cattle to go back and forth onto our property and their property, which they had cattle as well, so they shared the farming land. She got just about to that point where the tree is, and her horse just went berserk. He stopped. He was making all kinds of noises. He was turning his head around, and finally his ears perked up. He looked in one direction, and as soon as he looked in that direction, my mom looked over, and she saw this thing standing over near this small hemlock tree. And the hemlock tree was dead at the time, so it had no needles or anything on it, so she could see it clear as day. Even though it was a little bit dark in that area, she definitely could still see the outline of the creature, and it was fairly large. But she noticed that it had its hand up on a branch. And when she looked at the creature, she did say she noticed the ears on the top of the head, and she noticed on the hand that there were fairly large claws. And as soon as she saw that, of course, this was in a few seconds before the horse decided to just dart. So as she looked at that thing, she had just a little bit of time to look and see what it was, and then the horse took off, almost knocking her off the horse. She held on for dear life, and he just ran as fast as he could back to the house, and he was gone. And of course, after they got back to the house, she made sure the horse was back in the barn, and she got back into the house, and of course she was freaked out. She didn't know what just happened. She was pretty much blanked out at the time. The only thing going through her head was fear. She got in. My grandmother asked her what was wrong, calmed her down. And it took a little while to calm her down, but after that she completely forgot about what happened, and everything was back to normal, but she still wouldn't go back outside. And my grandmother and my grandfather, from what my grandmother was telling me, said that they went out in the barn, and Dancer was still going nuts. He was still shaken up, and he was still scared. My grandfather ended up going back out after my mom came back, and this is what my grandmother told me after the encounter my mom had. He went out back and took a walk back to the big maple tree that was there to see what she saw. And of course, my grandfather, when he got back there, noticed that there was a footprint underneath this hemlock tree that she saw this thing standing right under. And the branch that it had its arm up on was about his head height, maybe his shoulder height. So this creature that was standing there obviously was fairly tall, because if it had its hand on a branch that was about my grandfather's shoulder and head height, that would have to mean the creature was probably well over 8 or 9 feet tall. He saw the footprint there on the ground, and of course, he thought it was a bear. He didn't understand at the time. He's seen plenty of tracks, but he went back to the house where his supplies were, and he had just enough stuff to make a mold. It was kind of like wasn't really meant for making cast of footprints, but it was more used for fixing up sidewalks and that. But he took it back and he molded the footprint. And of course, the stuff was very brittle, so you couldn't really drop it, you couldn't hit it, because the footprint would just smash. So he brought it back to the house, but the whole time he was back there, my grandmother said that he was very uneasy. He never was like that before. He was never scared of the woods, but when he came back, he was just completely creeped out. Didn't understand what was wrong, and most of the day he was quiet. He showed her the footprint, and she thought it was a bear. He thought it was a bear. Nothing out of the abnormal. So they put the footprint away, and that was that. But all throughout the night, she said that he had a hard time sleeping. So obviously something was up. Yeah, I think that he knew something out of the normal was back there, and probably watching him while he was taking the footprint. And after that, I mean, he was a little bit more cautious about going out back there. And, of course, with the footprint that they made, this led up to the events of him having his strokes. And I was not able to actually talk with him more about his encounter, because by the time I was old enough to do so, he's already had like his 8th stroke, I believe, and he was unable to speak clearly. It affected most of his nervous system. He couldn't really move around as well as a normal human would. He was bound to a wheelchair. His speech was slurred. So you really had to usually it was with a notepad that he had to get people to, say if he had to go to the bathroom, he'd have to write on a notepad, or my grandmother usually would understand him. But at that time, I was unable to speak with him. But that was about it for that encounter.
Do you still have that cast your grandfather made of that print?
The unfortunate thing about the print is that got smashed years back. This was before I was actually able to go and speak with my grandmother more about it, because this was back when I was probably 11 or 12, and I had not yet heard of Dogman, and I was still really kind of a rookie with the paranormal at that time, so I didn't really understand much of it about Bigfoot or whatever. I had the books, but I was just starting to learn about that stuff. And I just recently learned, it was, I think, a couple of years ago, that the footprint had gotten smashed. I'm not sure what year it must have been smashed, but I know that she said my nephew accidentally took it out of the cupboard and he dropped it. And of course, the material was so brittle that when it hit, it just shattered into small pieces, so it was beyond repair.
Yeah, that's pretty unfortunate. You told me that when you took a look at that print, you noticed some interesting features. What were they?
As I can remember back when this was still in my high school days, I was able to look at the footprint. This is before I knew anything about the Dogman, of course, and I just took interest in looking at the footprint because I just wanted to see what it was, because at the time, when I was getting more and more into hunting with my father, he was always showing me different footprints. I'd seen black bear footprints at the woodlot. I've seen coyotes. I've seen all kinds of canine prints around. I've seen all kinds of bird prints, everything you could possibly think of. But this print was really creepy because when I compared it to a bear, because at the time I actually had a smartphone. This was like the first smartphone I had, so I was able to use the internet and actually look at it. I looked at it and I said, no, it wasn't a bear print, because I looked at it and I was like, well, this print is kind of abnormal. It has the same characteristics as a wolf print, but not just the characteristics of a wolf print. It was just much larger and was actually elongated. And if you look at the footprint closely, it actually had the indent of the dew claw on the back, so you could actually see that imprinted in the cast. And I was like, well, that's kind of odd. And I looked further at the footprint, and I noticed it was really long in shape, and I was like, well, that's kind of weird. Nothing around here has a shape of a foot that's close to 14 inches long. I noticed when he took the print, it was in mud. My grandmother told me about the print. Said that, yeah, he had to take the cast in a bunch of mud because where the thing was standing, the ground was really soft and muddy. So the print itself showed where the haunch of the foot had indented into the mud, so you could actually tell that, well, this had to have been a canine because the haunch had literally indented into the mud about 1 or 2 inches. So you can clearly see the foot, the claws, the dew claw, and the haunch that was rubbing up against the mud that was on the backside of the print. So I thought that was really odd when I saw that.
You mentioned that print was about 14 inches long, but how wide was it?
The print itself, let's see, if I compare it to my foot, I wear a size 13, and my foot is about a little over 4 inches across, maybe 5.5. So the footprint itself compared to mine was probably close to 7 to 8 inches wide.
That's a pretty big print.
It is fairly large.
Yeah, I'd say so. Since you were 5, you used to ask your mom about her encounter. Something about her responses confused you, though. What was it that confused you?
Oh, I used to pester her a lot. Not so much now. I mean, I still like to talk about it, but back when she first started telling me about it, she never really got into the details about her encounter. I said, well, what did it look like? What did it look like? I was always asking her, what did it look like? And she just says, well, it was really tall. She saw the hand, and she said it was just looked like a Bigfoot. And it just went on for years, and I was trying to get details out of her. I said, try and think back to what you saw. Like, what did you see? What do you remember about the details of what you saw? And then finally one day, we were driving back from Malone, and I was bored in the car, so I decided to get her to talk about her encounter a little bit more. She said, well, I did remember seeing ears on its head. And I started thinking, I was like, wait, ears? On the sides or on the top? She's like, well, on the top of the head. Like, oh, okay. And it's like, that couldn't be a Bigfoot because Bigfoot is more of a primate, so its ears are on the side, they're not pointy. And as soon as she said that, I started to think, this could be a Dogman. Because at this time when I finally got the details out of her, I'd already seen Dogman encounters multiple times, so this immediately rang the bell in my head. I was like, that's definitely not a Bigfoot. And then she mentioned the claws on the fingers. And I said, well, Bigfoot does have claws, but to the extent of what she saw, Dogmen always have claws on their fingers because they're a canine, so being a canine, they obviously have to have those claws for subduing prey, tearing apart flesh, just making it easier to eat. The Bigfoot sometimes may have claws, sometimes they'll have more human-like fingers, so they'll have fingernails that are closer to a human. So I started thinking about that, and I was like, well, that's definitely a Dogman, it can't be a Bigfoot. And then she did mention the legs, and she said the legs looked just like a canine would. They were the backward-facing legs that you would see on a dog, or, any kind of canine, or even a deer. If you were to see the deer when they bend their legs down, they have the distinct bend in their leg. And, of course, I started thinking about that. I was like, that's definitely not a Bigfoot, because, like I said, they're more humanoid in stance. So, over those years of her telling me these details, and finally, just recently, I got those details about what she saw, it immediately rang the bell in my head. I was like, that's definitely got to be a Dogman. Not sure what type of Dogman, but it was definitely one.
Yeah, it just sounds like a canine-type Dogman to me. And just so you know, Sasquatch, they never have claws. They always have fingernails and toenails. Some people mistakenly classify Type 3 Dogmen as being a type of Sasquatch, but they're not. They can look similar in ways to a Sasquatch, but they're definitely not a Sasquatch. Since your grandfather passed away, like you said, before you were old enough to take an interest in your mom's encounter, did you talk much with your grandmother about what had happened?
I just remember talking with her a few times. This was about 2014, I believe. This is currently when I was working at the housing division, because I went over and had lunch with her a couple times. And, of course, I like to strike up conversation with her, so I brought it up, and she talked with me more about the encounters and my grandfather. And she always did tell me about my grandfather being uneasy about the woods sometimes, and he, being native and being an avid outdoorsman, he was never scared of the woods, but sometimes there was just days that he felt really, really, really uneasy. And of course we got into talking about what she has seen, and she hasn't really seen very much. The one time she's actually, or two times actually, she's seen weird phenomena around the house. The first time was back when we originally used to have an old farmhouse there. She has a new house now. But the old farmhouse, the windows were about 10 feet off the ground. So any normal human being couldn't just walk up to the window and look in it. But she did think she saw a Bigfoot one day. Definitely couldn't have been a Dogman, because she said she did not see the ears on the head. She said it looked more humanoid. And it looked into the window at them while they were eating dinner. And my grandfather never saw it. She was the only one that saw it. Of course, after that happened, it disappeared. My grandfather went outside and looked, couldn't find anything, didn't see footprints. And then the second thing she saw was, I think, more of a UFO-related phenomena, because she looked into the driveway one night, and there was an orb of light that was in the driveway, and it sat there spinning and spinning and spinning. And finally, it zipped down the driveway and disappeared. That's really all she's seen as far as paranormal activity around the house. But she did say that my grandfather, when it came to the woods, he was a little bit more uneasy when he went back there, but it was only for a few years, because after his first stroke, he was unable to go back because he was bound to the wheelchair. But he said that it's very odd because of who he was. He used to go hunting all the time. I mean, he used to go out with my uncles, and of course he fought. Well, I don't know. I'm not sure if he was actually in combat or not. He was in Germany after World War II. He was an engineer. He cleaned up after most of the war, I believe. I think he might have actually been over there while they were still fighting, but this was like towards the very, very end, just before the Germans surrendered on May 6th. And he cleaned up a lot of landmines and that over there, and he actually witnessed one of his friends get killed by one. So course, he was really good at handling stuff that would make most people kind of lose their mind, because seeing somebody get killed by something like that is pretty unsettling. He was around in the woods over in Germany quite a bit, and he never thought of anything abnormal around there. And of course, their woods over there are actually quite creepy, from what he said. But other than that, around here, he was never very uneasy, and it wasn't until that day of the encounter that he actually was more unsettled about being in the woods.
You mentioned earlier, Dave, that your grandfather had had 2 experiences of his own. Please go ahead and tell us about those now.
The first encounter he had was, I think, more along the lines of a Sasquatch. This was out back of our house, because this back where both the encounters were, just different spots. The Sasquatch that he encountered, he definitely could see it. He saw it walking along the tree line where he was walking. But he didn't have that uneasy feeling like he was in danger, because on the res, Bigfoot is thought of more as a protector and more of a spiritual being. There's actually a painting I've seen on the reservation about Bigfoot. Was it my uncle took me over to the library, I believe is where I saw it, and he dug it out of a box, and it actually depicts a picture of a Sasquatch defending 2 native hunters from a pack of wolves. And it was actually a really interesting photo to see. I never got to see it again. I actually went back and asked them about it, and they didn't know where it was. But my grandfather also saw that painting that they made. Of course, after he saw that, he was never big into Bigfoot, but the legends had always circulated around the reservation. It's really big on the res. And he always thought of it as a protector. The chiefs, you name it, everybody throughout the res, everyone that was native thought of it as a spiritual being, a protector. Nobody that's going to hurt you unless, of course, you aggravated it somehow. But when he saw that out back of the house, he didn't feel like he was in danger. He just kept going about his business back there. And he actually thought that it was protecting him, because it was following him everywhere. It followed him all around the back of the property. And he thought it was kind of strange that why it was following him. It was keeping its distance, but it just kept an eye on him like it was protecting him from something. And of course, I think it was a few weeks after that, he went back there. And when he went back, he had that unsettling feeling he was being watched, but he also had that feeling he was in danger. And he just got that feeling that, this couldn't be the Bigfoot that's around here. There's something else back here that is watching him. And he actually did say that he smelt a really nasty stench when he was back there, like a mixture between like a wet dog and rotting meat. My grandmother was telling me that he heard and what he smelt. He never wrote this stuff down. This is all by her memory. I kind of wish that he wrote it down. Anyway, he smelt that back there, and of course he felt very, very uneasy about it. He actually ended up going back to the house because of that, and he didn't go back there for a few other days, but when he did go back, he made sure he brought his rifle back with him, because after the war he brought back an old German Mauser Kar 98. It's an 8mm round, so it's a very large round. If you were to hit something with that, it would probably definitely put a hurting on it. But he always carried that back with him. And he always told my uncles to bring some kind of firearm with him when they went back there. But as far as his experiences, those were the only ones that he's had up until his stroke bound him to the wheelchair. And that was about it for him.
That had to be so frustrating for him. Here you have a man who just loved being out in the woods, and then next thing you know, he has these experiences, including the one your mother had, that take away his ability to really relax and enjoy being out there.
Definitely. She said that he loved the woods. He was an avid outdoorsman. He really enjoyed being out there. When we were younger, he loved having us around the house. He loved having the kids around. Me, my other cousins, he just loved having us around. But my grandmother said there were some nights where, even though it was hard to understand because of the stroke, he wished that he was able to take us out and enjoy the woods with us or be outside with us and actually be able to take us out and do activities, but unfortunately he wasn't able to do that.
That really is a shame. At least it sounds like he lived a really full life.
Oh yeah, he was up there in age. He wasn't able to do much because of the wheelchair, but every single chance I got to go over and see him, I always sat down next to him when he was watching TV. He was always watching his westerns. his old war movies. I'd sit there and I'd talk to him. And of course, my grandmother said he just loved having us over. Me and my cousin Andrew, him and I were like the big movie fanatics back in the day. So we'd always sit there and we'd talk with him, and it was hard to talk with him because of his slurred speech, but we got used to it. We could definitely understand him, and he understood us. It was always the time of our life whenever we went and saw him. But we really miss him because of that. I really wish he was around today.
Oh, I can understand that. Yeah, I'm sure he had loads of interesting stories to share. I can only imagine. In 2011, you had some pretty disturbing experiences of your own. Please fill us in on them.
The first encounter that started it all was when we lived in Fort Covington. We came up for a weekend, and one of my friends from high school came up with me. I woke up one morning, and I was like, I don't want to play video games today, so I said, let's go out and do something. And of course, my mom, she'd had property around the house. The neighbors let us go out back, because we didn't own it, they owned it. It wasn't very big, so we couldn't really do much. There was a pond back there, we used to catch bullfrogs. But I got bored back there. I was like, let's go over to my grandmother's house. We should bring a bunch of plywood and that, get the four-wheeler, and go build a bridge across the creek. I said, there's no beaver house over there. Let's go build a bridge across that creek and get over into the beaver house and fool around in there. So I said, alright. So we got all of our stuff together, a bunch of old plywood, a bunch of old boards that my stepfather didn't want. And we went back, got all the stuff onto the four-wheeler, drove back. And of course we had to lug all the rest of the stuff back to the creek. And at this time, it wasn't all complete swamp like it used to. When I was younger, the property back to the entire swamp was just nothing but a mud hole. There was no place you can get across the swamp. There was one big pond in the middle of it, and that was it. But in 2011, Ducks Unlimited had already came back there, because my uncles had requested that they go back and dig out multiple ponds for the ducks and the geese, because it made suitable breeding habitat for them. And it was easier to get across because there's actually a little road that you could take. So anyways, we had to lug some of the equipment through part of the swamp because the road didn't go all the way across it. And we got back and we had built the bridge. It took us maybe 2.5 hours to finish it. Wasn't anything you could drive a vehicle across, but you could definitely walk across it. And after we completed it, we walked across and we got over into the area where the hut was. So we were looking at this hut and we noticed that this side of the beaver dam, or the beaver hut, was completely dug out with care. It looked like somebody had just dug out a perfect hole in the side of the hut. And of course the hut itself was fairly large. I mean, even for a beaver house it was large, but it looked like somebody might have been adding to it because of its size. The hut itself had to have stood well over 12, maybe even 15 feet tall. So even a man himself, a 6-foot man, wasn't able to look over the hut itself. Usually most beaver dams and beaver huts that you see, if there's dry ground, usually they aren't that tall, because beavers really aren't. They're large animals, but they're not that large. But anyways, the hut itself was massive. I mean, I've never seen a hut that big. So we looked around and we're looking at the hut. And I was like, this is kind of weird. It's like, I don't think beavers would dig a hole out in the side of it, because beavers only have a small compartment that they dig out underneath the house that goes out into the water, and that's the only way they can get in. They have other exits to get out, but it's mostly just to keep predators out. But something had dug a hole in the side of this hut, and it was big enough for, even a large man to fit into. And I said, well, I don't want to go inside of it, but I said, you're free to go into it. He's like, alright. So he got out his phone and his light, and he disappeared into the hut. And just as he got in there, he's like, dude, there's bones in here. He's like, wait, what? He's like, yeah, there's bones in here. I said, what kind of bones? He's like, oh, there's, it looks like cow bones. And it's like, oh, wait, there's a cow skull. And I was looking inside, and I could just kind of see the light, and I was looking at it, and I could just see over against the wall. He's like, oh, yeah, there are skulls in there. I looked, and it's a cow skull, and he's like, oh, there's deer skulls in here. And it's like, oh, there's even a horse skull in here. And of course, we're looking around, and he's like, man, there's bones everywhere in here. So, of course, he's like, alright, I'm gonna go further, and he says, there's another hole in here. I said, alright, I'm just gonna stay out here and wait. So I sat down, and he disappeared, and he didn't make a single sound. Because I couldn't hear him inside of the other part of the compartment that was inside of the hut. I could hear him scuffling around, that was about it. Well, he was inside the hut for probably 6 minutes tops. And I could still hear him scuffling around in there. And finally I got over to the hole and I yelled into him. I was like, you done in there? And I didn't hear him. And then I could see the light from his phone, and he just came flying up out of the compartment that was inside the hut, and he came flying out of the hole that he came in through, grabbed me by the shirt, and we took off across the bridge, and I was like, what are you doing? What are you doing? It's like, let me go. It's like, what's wrong? And he just kept pulling me and pulling me and pulling me, and finally got to the four-wheeler. So he's like, get on the four-wheeler, and finally I got on. He's like, I wasn't making any notions as to what was wrong. He didn't tell me. He said, we're going back. And of course, he gunned it. He turned the four-wheeler around, he gunned it. He didn't care if we were going to wipe out or not on that thing. He was gone. So I'm holding on for dear life on this thing, and he's just flying back to the house. And of course, we left some of our stuff back there, so it was kind of no point in going back because he wasn't going to go back and get it. And we went flying back to the house. We parked, and we sat inside in the living room, and I was asking him what was wrong, and he was just really quiet, and he had this really, really, really weird look on his face, like he was terrified, like he'd seen a ghost, and he actually was really pale. So we were quiet and really talked much, and eventually, we just sat there watching TV, and he actually struck up a few conversations, completely forgot about the incident. But it was still in the back of my mind. I was still sitting there thinking about it. And finally, my mom came, and she picked us up, and we got back to the house, and I figured, let's go upstairs, watch some movies, play some games. So we went upstairs, and I turned on the PS2, and of course, we were playing games for a while, and all of a sudden, he's like, you're not going to believe what I saw. It's like, what do you mean? It's like, you didn't tell me before. It's like I was shocked, man. It's like, you're not going to believe what I saw down there, though. I said, well, what did you see? He's like, well, it wasn't just the bones, but he said the odd thing was there was clothes down there. Like, what do you mean there's clothes? Like, there's human clothing down there. Adults, children, even infant clothes down there. But they're all, like, tattered, old, and something had used it to make, like, a bed down there, like a nest. I said, a nest? It's like, yeah, there was something made a nest down there. It was huge. I mean, it's like a bear could have sat in that thing and slept comfortably. Like, you're kidding. I said, nope. And he said the other scary thing was not just the bones down there of animals, but he said one of the bones that was down there shockingly looked almost like the femur from a human. And he's like, I know a lot about these bones. I've seen a lot of the bones around here from different animals. He said, that looked human. Like, it didn't look like it was from a deer or anything. It looked like it was from a human. And I said, see a human skull? And he's like, no, I didn't see a skull. There are a lot of deer skulls down there. But he said a lot of the bones resembled that of a human. He said there's even the rib bones down there that look very similar to a human. And he said he saw a spine that he said might have been a deer, but he said it shockingly looked just like a human spine. And it wasn't until he said he saw a jacket that was laying over in the corner, and he said what really, really freaked him out was the jacket had these distinct claw marks in it. It went down the front of the jacket and pretty much completely through the jacket, and he didn't say anything about bloodstains, but he said it completely freaked him out when he saw it. And it wasn't until he saw that he decided to get out, but he said there's another compartment that was inside of that hut. There was like 3 chambers in it. There was the top, there was the second one that he was in where he found that little nest, and then there was another dark hole that something had dug out further into the ground. And he said it was pitch black down there. He didn't want to go down. But he said he swore he could hear something in there. And he got out, and that's when he grabbed me and we took off on the four-wheeler. And he said that there's also this distinct smell down there. He said it was awful. It was like wet dog, and just, it smelled like rotten meat, like something had been rotting down there. And he said there's also the other scary thing. He said there was fur in that bed. He said there was hair. It was all over the place. Like something was shedding. And I was like, that's kind of creepy. I mean, it's like, I know dogs shed, but he's like, it wasn't no dog. Like, did you see any footprints? He's like, nah, the ground was way too hard because it was all dried out. They hadn't seen any moisture in there, so nothing could really make a distinct footprint in there. Once that happened, once he was freaked out, he just got out of there. He couldn't handle it no more. He just wanted to get out because, I mean, once the hair stood up on the back of his neck, he was gone. And he wasn't really much to get scared back then. I was really, really hard to scare that guy. But he told me everything about the hut, like I just mentioned. He was never one to lie to me. I've trusted him pretty pretty much my entire life. We knew each other for quite a while. I still know him, haven't seen him in a long time because he moved away. He was always truthful, never told me a lie, and I immediately believed it. So whatever he saw down there was definitely not normal.
Oh, I'd say it wasn't. It sounds like a den of horrors to me.
It was definitely a den of horrors. That when he told me that night, I couldn't sleep for a while. It was just going through my head. I was picturing what he saw. And I actually ended up having a couple of night terrors that night, and I was starting to think about it. I never saw anything in it. I just was picturing the den and the claw marks. And then the only thing that I could think of, as soon as I woke up, was that word was in the back of my head, but I just didn't want to think about it. And I was just werewolf was just indented in the back of my head. And it freaked me right out. So I woke him up and I was like, dude, it's I'm not gonna lie, but man, whatever you saw down there, whatever you smelt, it's kind of ringing the werewolf bell down there. And he's like, I don't even want to think of that word right now.
I don't blame him. Had you heard about anyone going missing back when you and your friend found that structure?
I never heard any word about people going missing. I know that even nowadays there's actually a lot of reports of people going missing. I know a lot of it's criminals because of the reservation. I mean, there's quite a bit of crime that revolves around there. But there have been some missing children around there, a couple missing adults. But nothing I've heard about people being missing because of an animal attack or being missing out in the woods. They've never really released full details about that. I'd actually probably would have to ask my brother-in-law because he works for the tribal police. He's actually a tribal cop, so I could actually ask him.
When you consider what your friend said he saw, it sure does make you wonder. Did you tell any of your friends about that structure and what your friend said he had seen inside?
We kept it to ourselves after high school. We didn't really mention it. A lot of my friends that I had at the time laughed at it. They said, you didn't see anything. It's you're making it up. It's no, we're not making it up. I said, I'll even show you the hut. It's I'll bring you back there. And, as soon as I said that, Curtis, don't take them back there. And it's well, why not? He's don't take them back there. It's I'm serious. It's I've never had a feeling like that before, such fear. It's don't go back there. It's not safe. And I was well, I gotta show them the hut. It's well, maybe I'll just bring them up close enough to see the hut itself, but not go inside. After I said that, he's well, I still don't want you to go back there. It's man, you're my best friend. It's still, that's not normal. It's what I saw down there was not normal. He said, don't go back there. So, I took his word for it, and I never went back there. I still haven't been back there to this very day. Most of my other friends, two of my best friends from high school, after he had left, they actually tried persuading me multiple times to go back there, and we went back. I think it was in 2014. We went and played airsoft back there. And then at the end of the day, they're hey, we should go see that hut. We should go see the hut. And I was nope, we're not going back there. And they said, oh, come on, let's go back there. We got the four-wheeler. Nope, we're not going. And of course, I got that feeling in the back of my head. I was yeah, we're not going to go back there. So, told them, that's that, we're not going. So, they always said, I think you guys were lying about that. And I said, well, if you want to go see it, then go see it. It's but if you go missing, don't blame me. So, one of my buddies was actually bold enough to go back by himself. And he went back there and he got fairly close to the hut. But the creepy thing was he said that when he got to the bridge, he said he thought he heard something moving around back there. So he just came flying back to the four-wheeler and came back to the house, and that was it.
How developed was that area around that beaver dam?
As far as houses and that, the nearest house was my grandmother's, but that hut itself was maybe 3 miles back. But the highway was another 5 or 6 miles further back if you were to head straight back from the hut. Most of the area around there was woods, so you probably, if I was going to give a guesstimate as far as the acreage around that area, there's well over 1,000 acres. I'd say maybe even 2,000 acres. So anything that was in that area, they're definitely well hidden, because there's not much activity back there. My uncle may go back there. He has the shooting range, but that's still quite a ways away from the hut. I don't think my uncles really drive back there very much nowadays, because I think from what I heard, the beavers have flooded out quite a bit back there, so it's very hard to move around. But as far as most other people, there really is not much activity around there other than the animals. That's about it. there's no longer cattle or horses because the farm's gone.
It does sound like it's an awfully remote area.
Definitely remote. They do hunt back there, but I don't think they go as far back as the hut.
Have you heard about anyone else having any other experiences back there?
As far as experiences, I haven't really heard anything in that exact area, but there are other areas on the res where people have had encounters with creatures that they don't really know or understand. One that actually came up in particular was what they called the Cook Road Car Cruncher. This was, I can't remember what year it was. This was definitely back when I was just a kid. My uncle still worked for the Environment Division at the time. He still does work there. Well, a woman had called in and said something attacked her car. And whatever attacked her car was going after a cat that had went up into the wheel well of the vehicle. And whatever attacked it had completely torn the side of the vehicle apart and completely tore off part of the wheel well and got into where the tire was. Actually had popped the tire. They took pictures of it. They took pictures of what the car looked like after the attack. And not just that, but they had a distinct police report on it. And the police report stated they took DNA samples of saliva and hair that was found on the vehicle. The weird thing about the attack was that there was claw marks on the side of the car. And they said they were fairly large. They said it wasn't a dog that made it. They didn't really get further into details other than what was wrong with the car. And they said that they found bits and pieces of a cat, because the cat that was in there obviously didn't make it. Whatever was attacking the car got the cat. They sent the DNA samples in, and they ended up getting them back. And at the time they got them back is when things really started to stir up in town, because the DNA test came back as an unknown canine. My uncle thought this was really creepy, and he ended up printing off the original police report and showed it to me when I was a kid. And I read it, and it creeped me out, because, like, immediately I was thinking, like, werewolf, and of course, that's what he was trying to scare me with. I mean, he obviously didn't know what it was. It was still registered as an unknown canine at that time. The really odd thing that happened was, as soon as that police report came back, it wasn't, like, until, I think, 2 days later, the government actually had come to the reservation. They went to Environment Division. They came in at night, and they were somehow able to unlock the door. They got inside, went into the lab. They took every single DNA sample they had in there. They went through all their files. They cleaned out every single file they had on the car attack, and everything about it had just vanished. They didn't have any information left on it. My uncle had a couple files at his house, which he kept secret, but it was just mostly just the reports and what they wrote down of DNA samples and that. And I'm not sure what he's done with them. I know he had pictures on his phone, the original pictures of the attack, but I know that just the main fact that it said unknown canine was what really creeped me out. But the government coming in and actually taking away the files and all the samples that they had in the lab really rung some bells. And after that, nothing really came up. And it wasn't until recently, which was weird, I saw a post on, I think it was Crypto Mundo. The website had the report on there, but the report was changed, and the picture that was on there was changed. And I looked at the original picture that my uncle had, and I said, well, this picture's not showing the claw marks on it. It looks like it was photoshopped. And you look at the car on the original, and you can see the claw marks on it, and the bite marks, and then you look at the new photo, and it just shows a destroyed part of a car. You could look at it, and you didn't really see any bite marks or claw marks on it. It looks like they were photoshopped out. And they also placed the blame on a pit bull in the new article. They said it was a pit bull that attacked the car and killed the cat. The weird thing was the tire that was in the original photo was completely ripped to shreds. And the new photo showed the tire as not even being damaged and completely inflated. Nothing wrong with it. And it just showed the fiberglass and the metal parts of the car scratched up and ripped apart. And that was it. And that was what was really creepy, because, well, the original was a true photo. It's like that wasn't Photoshop. That was right off my uncle's phone. It was right off the camera that they used to take pictures of the attack scene. And somebody had literally gone in, took that original photo, and changed it and made it look like it was just a dog attack. And that really, really, really creeped me out. But I knew it was really suspicious, because being one of the people that actually saw the original report And seeing this new one, I knew that something was up, and it was completely false, that it was not true, and blaming a dog was definitely not the right thing to do, because it wasn't a dog that did it. A dog did not do that to that car.
Pit bulls seem to always be blamed for incidents like that.
Oh, definitely. Dogs seem to take the blame for just about every animal attack. I mean, it's like even when you mentioned in the Monster in the House episodes 1 and 2, the law enforcement placed the blame on feral dogs.
They always do seem to do that. How close did you say that reservation is to where you were living at the time?
At the time, in Fort Covington, the reservation was maybe 5 or 6 miles away. From where I'm living right now, the res is about 10 miles away. So there's a little bit of distance between them, but there's a lot of state forest that actually borders between the res and where I'm currently living. So just about everywhere you go, the woods is linked some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, sounds like one of these things would have the run of the place.
Oh, definitely. Especially the fact that right now, where I'm living, I live next to Brazier State Forest, and I think the sign says that's over 18,000 acres, if I'm not mistaken.
That's a lot of land. You tell me there was another experience you had back in 2011 when you were camping one night.
This was during my cousin's graduation party. I was not old enough to drink at the time, but still did it anyway. Kind of a rebel. At that time, I especially couldn't let my dad know because he would have definitely not been very happy. My mom wouldn't have either. At the graduation party, they brought back some Pabst Blue Ribbon. They had some whiskey, and they got into it pretty heavy that night. I didn't really drink that much because I wasn't really into the taste of beer at that time, so I didn't really care for it. So I was sober. But both my cousins and my cousin's friend that he brought with him from Malone, they were fairly drunk. And of course we had his dog with us. She's a purebred pit bull, if I'm not mistaken. She's a very, very nice dog. She would never bite anybody, but if she was going to defend my cousin, then she would definitely defend him. I've seen her angry on multiple occasions, but not aggressive towards most people, mostly aggressive towards strangers. But we were sitting down that night, and this was wicked, wicked late at night. This was about 3 o'clock in the morning. This was like right after we actually ordered pizza at 1 o'clock in the morning and had them delivered to my grandmother's house, which I thought was kind of stupid because it's like, well, we're ordering pizza at 1 o'clock in the morning. I think they're going to get a little bit mad about that. But they didn't care. So we drove the four-wheeler out, got that, we came back and ate it, drank our beer, ate our pizza, whatever. Continued to talk, but it was about 3 o'clock in the morning, and I noticed there was something really weird going on, because usually the night animals, the crickets, the frogs, there was actually an owl that was near us at that one point in the night. He was fairly close, and he was just hooting away, and he didn't stop. He just kept going on for hours. And he was fairly close, because when he took off, I heard him fly off, and as soon as he did that, the crickets pretty much shut up. The frogs were all shut up. They didn't make a single noise. Every animal in the area was just dead quiet. The wind was just really, really slow that night. You could just barely hear it going through the trees. Those guys, they didn't make anything of it because they were obviously too drunk to care about it. But I was sitting there in my chair and I just noticed that something was really uneasy. There's something not natural in this spot. And of course, as I was sitting there, I kept hearing something walking around our camp, and it was circling us, and it just circled us and circled us and circled us. And I could hear the branches snapping, and of course I'm trying to tell these guys, like, there's something circling the camp. It's like, there's nothing out there. It's like, there's nothing to be scared of. It's like, you're in the woods, you're gonna hear stuff. I said, well, usually when you're out in the woods, you hear crickets, the night critters. They're always making noises at night. It's like, they usually do it all night long, right until dawn. And they said, well, maybe they went to sleep. It's like, well, oh my god, you guys, like, you're just ignoring me. So I sat there and I just kept listening and listening and listening and listening. And this thing was just circling and it just wouldn't stop. It must have circled the camp at least 20 times. Finally, I told them, I was like, there's something out there. It's like, you guys need to listen to me. And they said, that's probably our uncle's playing a joke on us. I was like, really? At 3 o'clock in the morning? Of course we're yelling. We're like, oh, get out of here. It's like, you're not going to scare us. And finally it stopped. And it just stood in one spot. I didn't really hear it moving around. I heard branches snap a little bit, but it was in the same area, so I knew it was just sitting there watching us. Right before we finally went to bed, I got this really nasty smell. It came across me, and it was the smell of wet dog, like really putrid wet dog. And that really freaked me out because I was thinking, well, maybe it's Chauncey. Maybe she got wet. And I looked at her, and she came over. I called her over, and I was petting her, and she wasn't wet. She was completely dry. And as soon as I did that, another branch snapped. As soon as she heard that, her head popped up, her ears went straight back, and her lips curled up, and she bared her teeth, and she started growling. And Dylan was he's sitting there in the chair, and he said, well, she's just growling at a friggin' rabbit or something. And I was like, there's no rabbit back there, so she wouldn't growl at that. She would chase it off. She wouldn't sit here and growl at it. She'd probably just chase after it. Dogs like to chase little animals like that just for fun. So we're sitting there, and this thing was still sitting over in the woods, way out of our view. We couldn't see. It was pitch black. Even the fire wasn't lighting up the woods. And she just sat there snarling, and she wouldn't stop, and she sat there looking the same place, and finally, it's like I started petting her a little bit, and then she kind of calmed down, and she just wouldn't stop looking in that same place. And, of course, we ended up staying up a little bit later, and finally, I was like, all right, I'm getting tired, let's go to bed. So, as we were getting ready to go to bed, she sat there, and she just kept staring in that same spot. And I could still smell that wet dog, and, of course, I knew it wasn't Chauncey. Finally, I said, oh, let's go to bed. So we went into the wigwam, and Chauncey was still sitting there, and finally we called her in, and she came in. And she laid at our feet the rest of the night. And, of course, what really freaked me out was the fact that this wasn't a zip-up tent. It was just a wigwam that they made from a tarp and a bunch of birch trees that they cut down. The flap to the tent, you could easily lift it up and drag somebody out if you really wanted to, and the scary thing was I was sitting in the middle of the tent, so I was really uneasy about sleeping that night. I stayed up probably about another 2 hours when we were laying in the tent. Some of those guys had already gone to sleep. And Chauncey was sitting at our feet for the rest of the night, and she was growling every once in a while. She'd hear a twig snap, and she'd growl. I think most of that night the reason why we were probably alright till morning is because she stayed right there at the edge of the tent there, and she'd growl whenever something would move. So whatever was outside knew that, well, we had some form of protection in the tent, and there was also 4 guys, so might not have been worth it to make any moves.
Thank goodness she was there.
She's actually a large dog. I don't think much. I mean, if we're talking about a dog man here, I know a dog man, they ain't gonna flinch much if they get attacked by a dog. I mean, I even saw that picture a couple episodes ago, that artwork that somebody drew. I don't know who drew it, but they did an amazing job. The picture of the dog man leaning over a dead grizzly bear.
Oh, Chris Chin.
Yep, that picture was really, really, really nice. I loved that picture. In fact, I saved it to my phone. I actually used it as a background for a while. But when I saw that picture, I was like, well, if a dog man could do that to a bear, a dog ain't gonna do nothing. So even with the dog we had there for protection, if they were hungry enough and they wanted to attack, they would probably still rip that place to shreds and us with it.
Yeah, even the biggest dog, I don't think that would be much of a problem for a dog man. You mentioned how Chauncey perked up when she heard that twig snap, but when you started smelling that stench, did she give any reaction?
Other than just her baring her teeth, my reaction when I saw her bare her teeth was just, I was ready to get up out of the chair and run, because as soon as she did that, I was like, this is not normal, this is not normal. I want to get out of here. The four-wheeler was like just within feet of us, so I was ready to get on it and just drive out. When she bared her teeth, it was the first time I've ever seen her really truly bare her teeth and show signs of like super aggression. But just as soon as her ears perked back, it was kind of like that moment in a movie where you think as soon as the dog perks its ears back and starts snarling, you think something's going to lunge out of the dark at you. But nothing happened apart from just her sitting there snarling, and we heard the twigs snapping, and that was it. And nothing else happened the rest of the night other than the occasional noises outside of the tent and the twigs snapping and her growling. But her reaction was, it was immediate. As soon as she heard that, ears perked back, bared her teeth, she was ready for a fight.
So that I'm clear on it, from what you say, she didn't really have any reaction when you smelled that stench. She didn't actually react until that twig snapped.
I'm pretty sure she could smell it. She didn't really sniff the air much, but I knew that she saw something. Because, of course, they can see better in the dark than we can. They see them black and white, and they can also see at night. We can't. So I knew that she must have at least seen it in the trees somewhere. So obviously she must have smelt it. All of her senses were pretty much perked right up at that point.
Oh, okay, I follow you now. You say you've heard unusual howls on multiple occasions. Please tell us about those experiences.
A lot of the howls I've heard, most of them were at my father's woodlot. This is down in Herman, so this is about probably 50 or 60 miles away from where I'm living right now, near Messina. The woodlot we were at, if you were to add everything together, including the land that we're allowed to hunt in the area, not just including ours that my father and my rest of my family owns, there's well over 800 acres, I'd say. But most of the activity that I hear is in back of our camp, and the howls that I hear usually are during the winter. I've heard them a few times during the summer, not until really late at night, but most of it's during the winter. The howls I've heard were just at the end of our night set, on the very end of deer season. This would be the second weekend in December, I believe. Because December 13th, my birthday, is towards the last weekend of hunting season. That's muzzleloading weekend. And then the weekend before that is the end of rifle. And those 2 weekends are when I hear it. But the howls that I've heard, the closest thing that they resemble are the howls that you would hear in the movie Ginger Snaps. I think every single movie that's the same howl. But the ones that they definitely resemble the best are from Ginger Snaps 3, the beginning. And it's actually more of like a moan crossed with a howl. That's what they're like. So it's really, really eerie when I hear them. But they echo through the woods. The woods just, it's so quiet during the winter you don't really hear very much, but as soon as you hear it, it just echoes throughout the woods.
I've got to give it to you. You definitely know your werewolf movies. Most people don't even know about Ginger Snaps.
I don't think it's really much of a known werewolf movie, if I'm not mistaken, because I didn't really learn about it till I was younger, because I'd already seen most werewolf movies, and I wanted to start watching them all, and I came across Ginger Snaps. And I was like, I wonder if it's a B movie. And it actually turned out to be pretty good. I mean, it's disgusting in some parts, but the third movie was probably the best out of them all. But when I listen to the howls in the movies, I tend to keep that sound in my head, so if I do hear something, I can actually compare it. Yeah, it was a hair raiser. You'd be sitting there, and as soon as you heard it, the hair on the back of your neck would just stand up, and you'd get goosebumps everywhere.
Oh, I can only imagine. Well, Dave, it's about time to get out of here. Do you have any closing comments you'd like to share?
Other than when people are out in the woods, definitely keep your senses at the highest, because, I mean, I'm not one to be scared of the woods, but whenever I hear things like that, I know a lot of it is unnatural, so if anybody that's ever had an encounter, even people that haven't had an encounter, these things are definitely out there. I know it for sure. You know, my mom's seen them. I haven't personally had an encounter with one. I don't think I want to, but they are out there. I mean, they're as real as you and me, so if you're out in the woods, just keep your senses at the highest you can, because you gotta try and outsmart them. That's basically the best you can do, is try and know that they're there before they see you. Then if you get a chance, get out of there.
Very well said. Well, Dave, thanks so much for your time coming on the show tonight and sharing these experiences with us. I really do appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me, Vic.
Thanks again for your time. Well, have yourself a great night.
You too.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye. Hi everyone, thanks for listening to another episode of Dogman Encounters Radio. I'm Vic Cundiff and I'll be your host for the show. If you've had an encounter of your own and would like to speak with me whether in private or on the show, please go to dogmanencounters.com and submit a report. I'd love to hear from you. While we normally focus on Dogman on this show, for tonight's show I decided to break tradition and bring on an eyewitness who encountered a different type of cryptid, what's called, seemingly, a cynocephaly. Izzy, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Hi, Vic.
Izzy, please give us a brief bio on yourself.
Well, I live in New Mexico. I'm in Santa Fe now. I'm from Cleveland, Ohio a long time ago. I'm a writer. I'm currently working at a deli. I just lead a kind of normal life, mostly.
Nothing wrong with that. That's what we're all doing. What kind of interest did you have in monsters or cryptids as a kid?
I've always had a bit of an overactive imagination, but I didn't have anything like a formal interest in monsters when I was a kid. I would watch Scooby-Doo and, monster movies and Gremlins and all that stuff, but I never really did any research on it before I was, a teenager or before my experience.
Oh, I see. Speaking of how you were when you were a kid, would you describe yourself as being an extrovert or an introvert? How would you describe yourself?
I was a pretty shy kid. I was pretty shy. My family moved from Ohio to New Mexico when I was 8 years old, and so there was an element of culture shock. And when I was growing up, I never quite fit in, not necessarily in a bad way, but I was always a bit of an odd man out.
Well, there's nothing wrong with that. That describes a lot of people. This encounter that you had that we're going to talk about tonight, did that have any effect, like making you more introverted?
I think to some extent it may have made it so I was more introverted in the sense that I didn't want to go out at night as much, like more introverted in a very direct sense. But other than that, not so much.
Well, that's kind of surprising. Since what we're going to be talking about tonight is centered around the town of Moriarty, please tell us about that town.
Moriarty, New Mexico it's a small town. I think it's about 30 miles southeast of Albuquerque, which is in the middle of the state. They're the self-proclaimed pinto bean capital of the world. They're named directly after the Sherlock Holmes villain, and they have a Sherlock Holmes Appreciation Society. But it's a small New Mexican town. It's centered on the highways, got lots of cornfields and pastures, which is around where I live near there, and lots of farming and cattle and all that. The landscape is very Great Plains-ish. Eastern New Mexico is very flat and yellow.
That is some pretty unique looking country out there, no doubt about that. You said it's the pinto bean capital of the world, huh?
Uh-huh. Yep.
That's funny. Why did your family move there in the first place?
My mother had gotten some inheritance when her grandfather died, and she has family out here in New Mexico. And that was just where we ended up.
You described the area around Moriarty, New Mexico, as being kind of strange or kind of off. Why do you describe it that way?
Well, it just has a certain presence to it. Like, when you're outside, you don't ever really feel alone. And I don't necessarily mean, there are werewolves watching me or anything quite so histrionic as that, but just there's a presence to the place, and you kind of always feel it. And it's almost oppressive sometimes. And sometimes it even feels like it's manifesting in the weather, like the wind out there would get so strong it would blow the roofs off sheds or houses sometimes.
Wow, that's no joke. Considering the fact that this place is in New Mexico, I'm wondering how close is this place, Moriarty, to the Crypto Four Corners area?
It's very far away. I mean, the Four Corners is at the northwestern end of the state, and this is not far south, but it's several hundred miles southeast of there at least. It's a big state.
Oh, there's no doubt about that. It is sizable. The reason why I'm asking about that is, while what you saw is not classified as being a dog man, it is something that has a dog head on a man-like body. It kind of reminds one, like you said in the pre-interview, of a minotaur. In the Crypt of Four Corners area, minotaurs are just one of the many strange things that people report seeing all the time. So I was
didn't know
wondering.
that.
Oh yeah, they sure do.
I have to look into that.
Yeah, if you look into that, you'll find that there have been a lot of sightings of things like that. In fact, I had someone on the show who, if I remember right, I think his wife saw some type of a strange, giant sloth-looking creature or something out that way.
Oh, I've heard of that one. Yeah. New Mexico it's an odd little paranormal hub of activity in the United States and in North America, because there's Roswell in the south, and there's White Sands, and there's all sorts of places that are kind of magnets for that sort of phenomena.
It sure does seem to be a strange area.
Although I can't say Moriarty specifically is one so much.
Before you had your encounter, were there any other strange experiences reported in that area?
I'm not sure. Like I was telling you during our pre-interview, I had weird experiences listening to the cattle being attacked by coyotes, and what I wasn't sure might have been something else. But I can't say that I'm aware of any other experiences that anyone reported there.
Please tell us about the murder of Robbie Stroop and how you think the creatures you saw might be involved.
Well, that was a boy who was killed shortly right before my family moved from Moriarty to Albuquerque, in a cornfield that was actually up the street from our house, probably a mile up the road. And it was a big media sensation thing out there. He was found in 17 places through the cornfield, I believe, is what the last report I was looking at said on it. And they did arrest a man who they believed had abused that boy, but they couldn't find any evidence that that guy had killed him. And it's kind of hard to connect the idea of a human being being able to do, I mean, even like your Ed Gein serial killers or something wouldn't be able to scatter someone like that. And so that happened a few years after my experience, and I always felt like that I knew what could have done it.
When you heard about his murder, what effect did it have on your psyche, wondering if it was them that had killed him?
Well, it chilled my blood, and even if I hadn't had that experience, that murder chilled my blood because it was right up the street from us anyway. Even if it had just been totally ordinary and they'd completely caught the person who'd done it, it would have really freaked me out because it was so close. And this was a cornfield that my brother and I would steal ears of corn from the edge of the field sometimes, and so it was close.
Yeah, that did hit pretty close to home. All right, Izzy, if you don't mind, please tell us all about this experience you had.
Well, I think I was 10 years old. This would be 1999. I think it was late summer, early fall. School hadn't started yet, and I was walking home right around dusk from some friends of mine's house. My mother's property was on 2 acres. It was a trailer and there was a barn, and it was right near a pasture. There was a pasture directly behind it. We had 2 entrances, and I sometimes like to walk across the whole field that we had before I came home. So I was walking home, and I was walking around the back, and I was kind of following the fence line, kind of lost in thought. Well, our neighbors had, and this was a very common thing, in the back of their property, our neighbors had a trailer that nobody was living in. When people would get new trailers, they would kind of sometimes, if they couldn't have the other trailer hauled off to the dump, they would just haul it to the back of the property and leave it there sometimes. And there was one of those at the back of their property. It was a totally normal thing. And I was walking the fence line, and I saw what appeared initially to be a man with something off about it standing at the fence like a human. And it was dusk, so, I mean, I felt like maybe my eyes are playing some tricks on me, or it's sort of that odd twilight hour. I mean, if you've never been at twilight in New Mexico, it's hard to describe, but we have very distinct light patterns and weather here. But it was twilight, and I see this what appears to be a man, sort of blurry, and I walked towards it, and I recognize that it is just odd that it has the head of a large wolf or dog. It's unclear to me which, just big canine-like head attached to a man's body. So from the shoulders down, it is a very large man. And not large in the sense of like it's a giant or anything, but large in the sense that it's a reasonably big, like Schwarzenegger-sized man. Big, muscular. And it has this, its head is just like something you're not supposed to see. And, it had this very odd effect on me, like looking at it, almost like a hypnotic effect. And I walked towards it, and I stood across the fence from it, and the fence was probably 5 feet high. And I'm looking at it, and it's looking at me, and it has these sort of ambery, yellowish eyes that are kind of flickery, almost like luminescent, like electronic, sort of. So the thought passes through my head that this is a person in a mask. But as I stare at it, it becomes clear that it doesn't quite look like that. It's too flesh-like, too real. And it's looking at me, and I can't see its teeth, but I can see its tongue sort of dart in and out of its mouth a bit. And its ears are twitching. And I'm looking at it, and the only way to describe the presence it kind of imbued on me is almost like when you hear about a snake hypnotizing a rodent. It's terror, but it's also like freezing. Like you don't know what to do. I'm going to stay here and hope I turn invisible. And I'm staring at this big man with this dog animal head. And I don't know how long I stared at it. It was sort of one of those time was gone sensations. I don't think I really stared at it very long, but it was looking at me. And it turned around and started walking toward the trailer. And at this point, my thoughts are racing, and I'm trying to figure out, okay, what do I do? Because I'm frozen, I'm paralyzed. It walks towards the trailer, and its movement is that of a man. Its movement is not canine at all. It is a man. As it's walking towards the trailer, I'm looking at it, and I realize it sort of has odd clothing on. It doesn't have a shirt, but it has like hide pants, like you'd see, like you'd expect like a fur trapper in the 19th century to be wearing, but very thin. They're very thin, very worn hide pants that are a tan color, and it has these boot things that are sort of like a wrap, like there's what is the word for that? I can't remember the word, but there's a specific term in Russian for these wraps that the Russian military actually wore until like very recently instead of socks. It's like a piece of cloth that you wrap all the way up to your knee. And it's made of this sort of similar like dark tan hide material. And I'm staring at its back, and I'm just kind of trying to take everything in. And it goes towards the trailer, and it walks up the stairs, and it opens the door, and I see sort of the silhouette inside of another creature like it. I can see the white skin of another man, but the top of its head, like the neck up, is still this black, dark shape. And I am pretty sure I know what it is because I've seen this other one so closely. And they start talking, but the way they're talking, it's not a language I understand. Well, when I got older, I heard what's called Mongolian or Tuvan throat singing, and it's kind of like that. It's a modulated, whistling pitch talking that moves up and down, almost like a musical sound to it, like a musical growl that's vibrating. And the one on the stairs who I've been staring at, it kind of waves its arm, gestures towards my direction. And that was when I really freaked out. I proceeded to bolt back to the trailer that my family lived in. I ran for my life. It was odd because it was so human-like that it was like 90% human, but it's the 10% that's not. It's like the uncanny valley concept, you know? The uncanny valley is this notion that with robots, that a robot that looks almost human is going to terrify people the most. So when you see a mannequin that's very lifelike, but you can still tell it's not, it's sort of like that. It's so close to human except for the head. And anyway, I bolted back home and went into my room and did not come out for the rest of that night, I believe. And it exuded a presence on me is the only way to describe it. Like a hypnotism, like a mental, no, like there wasn't a psychic connection or anything so obvious as that, but it was like it left its footprint, a mental footprint in my head. And that was very upset. It was upsetting. Although my memory is a little fuzzy about what happened after I got home exactly. I mean, I remember sort of being unnerved more so than frightened, more just unsettled on a very deep level.
Oh, I could understand why you would be so disturbed and unsettled. How long after your encounter was it until you heard the term cynocephaly?
Oh, years. We didn't have the internet back then, so I couldn't just hop on. This is 1999 in rural New Mexico, and anybody who has the internet has dial-up, and most people don't. So I didn't know what it was until I was a teenager. But I would see like werewolf movies. I would see American Werewolf in London, or The Howling, or Silver Bullet, the Stephen King story with Gary Busey. That's a fun one. But I would see those, and I would go, no, that's not it. No.
I'm glad you did eventually find out about the term and find out that people have been reporting seeing cynocephaly, or things that seemingly are almost identical to what you say you saw that day. In all of your studies, what can you tell us about cynocephaly?
Well, cynocephaly are part of a tradition in the ancient world of animal-headed people. You'll find all through these different cultures, particularly of the Middle East, all through India and Greece, the center of the classical world, so to speak. These traditions of hawk-headed men and dog-headed men and all this stuff. And they're not necessarily connected to the idea of werewolves, even though there are similarities. And Marco Polo wrote about claiming there were islands of cynocephaly. And in China, there's a rich tradition of stories about villages of cynocephaly. And to some extent, the idea of the cynocephaly, from the Greek version of it, which is where I'm most familiar with and which is where the word comes from, does stem from sort of a xenophobia of their neighbors. It's like, oh yeah, those people who live to the west are dog-headed cannibals. But it persists throughout antiquity and afterwards. Columbus claimed to have seen them, as did some of the Spanish explorers when they were coming into North America. Some of them possibly coming into New Mexico, although I'm not sure the exact details of that. But the cynocephaly are basically described as men with the heads of dogs, but the man part is not gone. It's not like the idea of a dog man or werewolf, which is a bestial thing. These things are like, well, humanoid, mostly human.
I've got to tell you, Izzy, it sure blew me away when I found out that people to this day are still reporting seeing them. How blown away were you when, in your research, you found out that that was the case?
I was pretty blown away. I mean, what I've been more blown away by is how, I don't know if lucky is the word because it kind of freaked me out, but how rare it would be to seemingly see one. It doesn't seem like, Dogman encounters and Bigfoot encounters, and there's communities of people, but for what I saw, there doesn't seem to be a lot of people who've seen them. It seems fairly rare or incongruous.
It sure does seem to be that way. I'm not sure how familiar you are with the show, Izzy, but we have had guests on before who talked about cynocephaly and their ties or possible ties to dogmen. Did you know about that?
I've listened to a fair amount of your show, but I don't remember hearing that. Would you enlighten me on that?
I've been trying to remember which episodes we did talk about cynocephaly and their possible ties to dogman sightings, but I can't remember. That's something I'm going to have to look into.
One thing that I do find very interesting about the word cynocephaly is etymologically it serves a very similar purpose as the word dogman, and that the ancient cultures did have traditions of werewolves, but the cynocephaly, the word cynocephaly essentially means dog-headed man, so it's used to distinguish it from an actual thing that transforms from a man in the same way that you have been using the word dogman.
I don't know, Izzy. It's hard enough for me to get used to the fact that we have dogmen out there in the world. But to get used to the idea that we have things that look like cynocephaly, that's just so hard for me to process.
It's been difficult for me to process. For me, there's always been an element of what I experienced where a part of my brain says, did you hallucinate that? Because there was such a unrealism to it. It was very surreal, you know?
Oh, I'm sure it was. I think the hardest thing to process for me is the fact that you saw pants and boots. Now, we're not talking about Levi's and Ugg boots or something like that. You said they were animal skins, but still, for you to see something that looked like that had animal skin garments on, that's just so hard for me to process. You were there, you saw it, and you still have a hard time processing it and accepting it.
That's one of the things that I found most interesting about the concept of the cynocephaly is that I'll send you this picture from what's called I think it's called the Nuremberg Journal, which is like a 14th century German etching of a cynocephaly. And in this picture, which might be the most well-known example of a picture of them, it is wearing a robe and it is wearing human clothing.
I've seen that picture.
I have trouble looking at that for more than a few seconds.
Yeah, it is pretty disturbing, isn't it? How did their behavior that night vary from what you'd expect a dogman's behavior to be?
Well, I mean, a dogman or a werewolf, which, from what I understand, if you're having an encounter with a dogman or a werewolf, you don't stop to think, to distinguish, oh, is this a dogman or is this a werewolf? No, it is this big humanoid monster. And these things weren't, I mean, they were unsettling, but they weren't necessarily monstrous, if that makes any sense. There was a human element to it. And when one of them pointed towards me, kind of gestured towards me, and they were just this whistling talk, it was very clear they were talking about me. There was an element of, oh, the adults are talking. It was sort of similar to like when you're a kid and you're in trouble. It's like, because they feel closer to us than, say, a Beast of Bray Road or anything like that. They feel dangerous because they had this big muzzle and this mouth, and I didn't see the teeth. The teeth were hidden behind the lips like a dog, and these unsettling eyes, but it's so human that you don't feel that it's quite as predatory as, say, a werewolf would be.
When you looked at their hands, did you notice any claws on their fingertips?
No. From what I saw, their hands were perfectly normal. Well, the one that I saw anyway, its hands were a man's hands.
That is so disturbing. You mentioned how they seemed to be hanging out in that trailer. Don't kids, from time to time, play around them so that they would notice if something like that was living in those trailers?
Well, they would, but the kids certainly wouldn't go there at night. No way would any of the kids. I mean, that's one of the things I always ask myself is, where were these things staying? And the only answer I have to that is, well, they may have been sleeping at some points in these various abandoned trailers. I mean, that is a legit question, because it's like, there's nowhere to hide on the plains, in the prairies. There's no forest, there's no trees, there's no underbrush. There's just sort of an expanse of blankness, and you have to go 20 miles north of there before you start getting into an area called Chilele with hills and mountains, where the mountains start to pick up, the foothills. So, I mean, that's always my question is, where are they hiding? And the only answer I have is all these abandoned human structures, which there were quite a few in 1999, and there are probably more now, what with the economy being far worse now than it was back then. But again, I mean, you'd think the kids would notice them. But at the same time, I mean, I have this kind of idea that there are places that human beings instinctually don't go. And I think if you're a kid and you're approaching a trailer and it has one in there, something in there that you're not supposed to see, you get this sensation of, I shouldn't be here. And I think that, even though we don't think about it very much, I think that has an impact on our experiences with things that we would not consider normal. That sort of gut feeling of, don't go there.
How far was that trailer from your home?
So it was a 2-acre property, and our trailer was at the front end, and this was much closer to the back end. So this was probably a good 1.75 acres away, because it was in the neighbor's yard, and it was separated by a fence. So a decent distance.
Yeah, sounds like it was. When you're describing that area, you mentioned how austere the layout is. With that in mind, could you still see that trailer from your house, or was there something in the way? Because I know the fence you've been talking about was actually not a privacy fence, it was a wire fence.
Yeah, it was to keep the dogs inside. I don't think it would be, because we had what's called oss trees, which are a kind of Australian willow that grow really well in certain parts of New Mexico, and we had some groves of them, and they're not thick enough to hide very much, but they can kind of obstruct your view a bit of something in the distance.
That makes sense, then. I can understand why you wouldn't be able to see it. Please tell us about the parasitic element you think these things have.
Well, the idea of them living in this abandoned trailer is, it seems almost as if they were like they were squatting, like they were staying here because they're human enough that the word squatting seems to apply. And I felt like, and this is a leap of logic, I know, but I felt like they were living off of our cast-offs, so to speak, which included the cattle, and which I always wondered if the thing's clothing came from human cattle. I can't think of anything else it came from. But I always felt like there was an element of them living off of us. Not necessarily preying on us mostly, but living off us.
Did you have any wild goats or anything like that was in the area that they could have been feeding off of? What do you think they ate if it wasn't cattle?
Well, I think that to some extent it was cattle, but there were also neighborhood dogs, and there were rabbits and cats, and people who out there either let their dogs run wild or put their dogs on chains and have them with dog houses, so that's easy pickings. And animals would go missing all the time, although we would usually chalk it up to the coyotes.
Were enough animals turning up missing to, in your opinion, support something as big as what they were?
If there's only a few of them, possibly. But again, for the most part, we did ascribe most animals that went missing to coyotes. Although we did, at my family, we had a dog that went missing that we couldn't figure out what happened to at one point, like totally missing. Like usually if the coyotes got your animal, there would be remains. On this one, we couldn't figure out if someone had stolen our dog or something, or what. And that was about a year later, although I kept my suspicions to myself.
It sure does make you wonder.
Every once in a while you get a bobcat, too, come down from the hills.
Yeah, I could see bobcat picking off a smaller dog or even cats, but for the bigger dogs to go missing or cattle to come up missing or dead, that wouldn't be so easy to explain with bobcats.
Yeah, bobcats are they're not the size of mountain lions. They're not that giant.
You talked about being just about 5 feet away from this creature. When you were that close to it, did you ever smell anything?
I didn't smell. I don't recall any smells. I've never had a particularly strong sense of smell.
How long did you live in that area after you had that encounter?
Well, we moved there in February of '98, and we moved out in either April or March of 2002. So we lived there for probably another 2.5 years, maybe.
Why did your family leave?
My mother couldn't find work out there. My parents divorced shortly after we moved to New Mexico. My father moved to the city, and my mother ended up moving to Albuquerque as well because that was where the work was.
That makes sense, following the work. If you wouldn't have gotten out of there the way you did, how certain are you that you would have been hurt?
At the time, it didn't occur to me. I was scared sometimes, and I avoided going out at night, and I sure avoided any abandoned trailers. But, it wasn't until the Robbie Stroop murder, and then later what happened to my mother's tenants, it wasn't until that it really hit me that I could have been in serious danger.
It sure does make you wonder if you would have stayed around, even a week or so more, if something like that would have happened to you. You kind of got into this a little bit ago, but I want to really flesh this out to make sure we're not missing any points here. What features did you see in that creature that convinced you it couldn't have been a man in a costume?
It just looked too real. It was looking at me, and it had a tongue that was twitching, and ears, and a head, and I couldn't, with a mask, there's a seam, sort of, when someone's wearing a mask, there's usually a line of demarcation on the neck where you can see the rubber, even if it's a particularly realistic mask. But that's impossible to hide with a man without a shirt on. And in this case, it was just sort of like instead of a human neck, it had this sort of dog neck that just kind of sprang up like I wish I'd gotten a closer look at its neck so I could see the exact place where its human parts start turning to animal, but it's so to the point where it's almost like a beard hiding the neck. So you can kind of see the outline of it, but you can't see particularly close, you know?
Well, I can appreciate you saying that now, but I'm so glad you didn't get a closer look.
Yeah, me too.
I don't think that would have been good. You talked about heading for the high country once they started kind of gesturing your direction, but did you ever get the impression they were chasing you?
No, I did not. I mean, I didn't look behind me, but the farther I got away, the better I felt, and I did not feel they were chasing me. Plus, it did occur to me that even though these things were not normal humans, I mean, this is a 5-foot-high fence. If you want to get over that fence and you're an adult man, you're going to have a hard time, and you're going to have to go around the other end of the property. So I wasn't expecting them in any way to be behind me.
I'm so glad they didn't give chase.
I mean, it's weird because I never saw them again, and I certainly didn't go looking for them, but I felt a presence with me constantly for the remaining time we lived there. So it's hard to describe. I just felt like I felt like it had left something in my head.
Yeah, that's pretty commonly reported with dogman eyewitnesses. Let's talk about the healing process now. How much trouble did you have getting over that experience?
In the short term, I don't think it affected me very much in the short term because I just kind of did everything I could to put it out of my mind, try to repress it as much as I could. But as I got older, I started having night terrors, and I still have night terrors to this day that are related to that. So in the long term, it kind of left this sort of scar in my brain that kind of made me kind of noctophobic, you know, fear of the dark. I don't like having the closet door open if I'm sleeping. I don't like going out at night. That's a big thing for me.
Well, I can definitely understand that after an experience like that. This is kind of a pick-em question, but what was the hardest aspect of that experience for you to get over?
Just knowing, it's sort of like the veil being lifted. Just knowing that there's things like that out there kind of shatters your attempts to have a totally scientific worldview.
Do you consider yourself to be over that experience?
For the most part, I mean, when I'm awake, I am. I mean, when I'm having nightmares related to it, I'm not. But consciously, I am.
You talked about being afraid of the dark and having some other hang-ups like that, but like I told you in the pre-interview, those are problems that people who haven't had an experience like this are fighting and trying to deal with, so it really doesn't make you all that different from everyone else.
Yeah. I mean, I get intense night terrors. Some of them, not all of them, but some of them, it's like I feel that presence with me again, as strong as it was when I'm 5 feet away from it. That's upsetting.
Oh, I'm sure it would be. If you had kids, would you or wouldn't you tell them now that monsters aren't real?
I probably would remain neutral on the subject, but would probably be pretty protective of them. Luckily, I don't have any yet, so.
If you've had a dogman encounter or encountered one of these things, I can't see how it would be easy to sit there and tell your kid that monsters aren't real when you know that something like that is out there.
It's certainly something someone who's seen something like that has to struggle with if they decide to have children, yes.
That's a problem I'm glad I don't have to deal with. How far did you say you live from where that happened now?
I live in Santa Fe, which is probably over 100 miles north.
At least you're pretty well removed then.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's gotta help. Please tell us the story behind what happened to your mother's tenants.
Well, when we moved out, my mother found people to rent a trailer to own for, a rent-to-own deal, that is. They were a family, 2 young boys who were a little older than me, and their mother and their father, and they had some trouble. The husband, he passed away in a rather odd accident. He was driving a dry ice truck, and there was a carbon monoxide leak that poisoned him, and he died from that, and things kind of went downhill from there, and this went on for years. The woman who was supposed to be paying the rent was on and off with the rent, didn't pay my mother the rent. My mother was very understanding, and she'd never been a landlord before, so at one point she went a year without getting any rent from this woman, and she ended up taking her to small claims court, and basically made her promise, you're going to pay your rent, because anyone else would have kicked you out. And she said, okay. And very soon after that, she and her 2 children vanished. This is probably 2006, I think. 2006 sounds right. Maybe 2007. I mean, my memory's a little fuzzy sometimes, but 2006 or 7, she vanishes. And this is, I mean, at this point, the internet is a thing, and it is very hard to completely disappear from anywhere. I mean, 30 years earlier, you could go to the next town over and start a new life, but you can't do that now. People find you, and I don't know if anyone filed a missing persons report on them or anything, but they just, in the wind, you know. And we went to the trailer to try to figure out what was going on, and not only were they gone, but the entire property was really trashed, and trashed in an odd way. There was a lot of trash and a lot of hoarded things, some of which were possibly stolen, like piled up, and lots of cigarette butts. Out there were a lot of people who had meth problems. I mean, in New Mexico, even before Breaking Bad made everyone aware of it, New Mexico's got a bad methamphetamine problem. And when people trash a trailer when they're on methamphetamine, you know, there are burn marks, there are telltale signs. There was none of that here. The copper wire wasn't stripped from the walls, which is sort of your telltale sign that there have been serious drug addicts living here, is that they take the copper wire when they leave. Copper wire wasn't taken. These people were just gone. And that disturbed me very much, because I felt like I couldn't help thinking that something about the presence of whatever it is that I had seen may have influenced it. Or taken them, I don't know. I mean, that's a jump to conclusion, but they were gone.
When you were checking out that area, did you ever find any strange footprints, like ones that might have been left by their feet that had those animal hide style boots on them, or did you find anything else like that?
No. This is hard grass prairie land. It's hard to leave a footprint. I don't know if their foot wraps would have left anything that looked different from a normal boot. But between that and the murder that happened shortly before we left, it was after both of those things had happened that I really started having more night terrors, because I realized that these things could have been truly dangerous.
Well, you didn't see them ransack that trailer, so I guess we'll just never know on that. From the way you talk about this experience, am I to understand that you never did see them again after that one night when you did see them and have that encounter?
Yeah, I never saw them again. I heard the thing with the cattle a few other times, or with dogs, but I never saw them again. And I think some element of my never seeing them again is I was deliberately not looking for them. See no evil, speak no evil.
How many people have you shared this experience with?
Not very many. An ex-girlfriend of mine who told me I may have been schizophrenic. Or asked me if I was schizophrenic.
Oh no, did she ask you that after you told her the story?
Yes.
Yeah, that was awfully mean of her. I'm sure you fully understand how hard it is to believe such a story, not having been there, the way I wasn't there, the way she wasn't there, the way people listening to the show weren't there. I'm sure it comes as no surprise that when you listen to such a story, you're automatically very cautious and very skeptical about whether it really did or didn't happen. I will tell you that you most definitely do not impress me as being someone who's not of sound mind. After the extensive talk we had in the pre-interview, I don't believe you to be a liar either, for whatever that's worth.
Well, I mean, there's always an element in my own head that says, did this really happen? Like, I've called it into question myself a million times.
Oh, I think for almost anyone who has an experience like that, they're going to feel the same way. It's just so hard to swallow that in this day and age, things like that could be out there in the dark places of the world. But then again, this is a show about dogmen, and it's so hard to believe that something like dogmen or Sasquatch could be out there. The cynocephaly, if this was a one-off situation where no one had ever reported seeing something exactly like what you say you saw that night, that'd be one thing. But you're talking about seeing something that has been reported since antiquity, and it continues up to present day where people report seeing these things. I really don't know what to make of it, but I do believe you.
Oh, thanks. I mean, I do feel, like I said, I feel like there's that instinct that says, don't go here. And I think that same instinct is what led people, before they'd mapped out the entire world, to write things like, here be monsters at the edge of the map. I think they wrote that because some people knew what was out there. I think in our own modern age, where we have all this amazing technology and all this stuff, I think for better or worse, we're less quick to accept these things.
Oh, sure we are. Yeah, when we're in the modern age of technology and we can do all the things that we can do, yeah, it's so hard to believe that something like that could be out there, but there are a lot of places that we haven't explored, and there are a lot of answers that we still don't have.
Yeah.
That's how it is. Well, Izzy, do you have any closing comments you'd like to share?
Just, if anybody else out there has seen them, you're not alone. That's all I have to say as far as that goes, because there is a sensation of feeling alone in this experience, for me anyway, that I've struggled with. It's me and Marco Polo, and that's about it.
Yeah, I'm sure it seems that way. Like I said, there are people still to this day who report seeing things like this, exactly like what you said you saw that night, so it's not just you, you're not alone.
That's comforting in a way.
Yeah, well, I hope it does comfort you. Well, Izzy, thank you so much for coming on the show tonight and sharing this experience with us. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you for listening, Vic.
Oh, anytime. You're welcome. Well, have yourself a great night.
You too.
Thanks.